I stood in the shadows of the grand ballroom and watched my sister drink champagne she had paid for with stolen money. She was across the room near the string quartet, in a dress that had probably cost more than my first car, and she was doing what Clara did best in rooms like this, radiating the specific, effortless warmth of a woman who has never once, in a public setting, allowed anyone to see what she actually was. She was laughing at something the deputy mayor had said. She was touching his arm. She was the golden child of the Vance family, the face of the Vance Foundation, the pride of a grandfather who had spent 80 years building something he believed she would carry forward. In my inside jacket pocket was a manila folder, not thick, 23 pages, but each page carried the specific, catastrophic weight of documentation that has been assembled by someone who knows exactly what they are looking at and has been careful to look at everything. Bank records, wire transfer logs, foundation disbursement sheets cross-referenced against actual charitable expenditures, an offshore account number and the entity structure attached to it, registered in a jurisdiction chosen for its discretion and traced, with some effort, to a name I recognized. I had been building that folder for 4 months. I had been afraid of my sister for 5 years. She didn't know that the second thing had ended. To understand how I ended up in that ballroom with a folder that could end her, you have to go back to a family vacation, and a laptop I left unlocked for 45 minutes. And the night my sister walked into my bedroom with the expression of someone who has just discovered that the game they've been losing has new rules. The Vance family had been in shipping for 3 generations. My grandfather, Arthur Vance S.R., had built the company from a regional freight operation into one of the largest private logistics firms on the eastern seaboard, through a combination of genuine business instinct, relentless work, and the specific, iron-willed stubbornness of a man who had decided what his legacy was going to be and had never once reconsidered. He was 79 when the story I am telling began, and he was the kind of 79 that certain men achieve when they have never stopped moving, still in the office 4 days a week, still chairing board meetings, still capable of a silence that made CFOs recalibrate their quarterly projections. He had 2 grandchildren. Clara was 31, 4 years older than me, and she occupied the role of family representative in the way that certain people occupy roles, completely, naturally, as though the role had been built around them rather than assigned. She sat on the foundation board. She attended the charity galas and the political fundraisers and the private dinners where the Vance name was currency. And she did all of it with the ease of someone for whom social performance was not a skill, but a metabolism. I was 27, and I ran the numbers. Not officially, my title was Director of Financial Operations, which was accurate but understated, in the way that titles in family companies often understate the person who is actually keeping things functioning. I handled the accounting across 4 subsidiary entities, managed the foundation's financial reporting, liaised with the auditors and the legal team, and produced the internal analyses that my grandfather used to make decisions he trusted because he had learned, over 4 years of working with me, that my numbers were correct. I was good at my job. I was also in ways that my grandfather did not know and that I had spent years carefully ensuring he didn't know, not the version of myself that the Vance family's particular tradition would have approved of. My grandfather was a man of his generation in the specific way that mattered. He had ideas about what the family line required, what the heir was supposed to look like, what the private life of a Vance man was supposed to contain. These ideas were not cruel, exactly. He had never expressed them with cruelty. They were simply firm, foundational, and not up for discussion in the way that some things in old families are simply not up for discussion. I had known, from the time I was 19, that who I was did not fit what the Vance family required. I had managed this knowledge the way you manage a structural problem in a building you cannot leave, carefully, continuously, with the constant low-level attention of someone who understands that the gap between who you are and who the building thinks you are requires maintenance. Clara found out on a Tuesday in August, during a family vacation at the house in Maine. I had been careless. Not recklessly, I had been careful for 8 years and careless once, for 45 minutes, when I left my personal laptop unlocked on the writing desk in my room to take a phone call from the office that ran longer than expected. Clara had come looking for a phone charger. She told me later, which was possible and also irrelevant. She knocked on my door that evening at 9:15. I remember the knock specifically, 3 light taps, unhurried, the knock of someone who is not asking permission. She came in and sat down in the chair by the window, and she looked at me with the expression I had last seen on her face when we were children, and she had found something she was deciding how to use. "I was looking for a charger," she said. "I know," I said. She let the silence sit for a moment, arranging herself in it comfortably, the way she arranged herself in every room she entered. "Daddy's not going to like this," she said. "Grandpa's definitely not going to like it." She tilted her head slightly. "So here's what's going to happen. I need you to cover my Milan trip, all of it. The flights, the hotel, the shopping. Consider it a courtesy payment for my discretion." I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at her and felt the specific, physical sensation of a door closing. Not dramatically, just the soft, final sound of something that had been slightly open for a long time settling into its frame. "How much?" I said. She named a number. I paid it. 5 years is a long time to be afraid. What I want to convey, because it matters for understanding what I did eventually and why I did it the way I did it, is that the fear was not constant in its intensity but constant in its presence. It lived in the background of everything, every family dinner, every board meeting where Clara sat across the table with the composed expression of a woman doing her charitable duty, every conversation with my grandfather where I felt the specific vertigo of speaking to someone who trusted me completely and knew me incompletely. The fear was the water I moved through. I had learned to move through it efficiently, but it was always there. Clara's demands escalated with the practiced patience of someone who understood that sudden large jumps would create resistance, while gradual increases would simply become the new normal. The Milan trip became a pattern of travel expenses. The travel expenses expanded to car payments. She went through vehicles with the acquisitive restlessness of someone who understood that the cars weren't what she actually wanted, but hadn't identified what was. The car payments became debt coverage. For debts I wasn't shown the origins of and didn't ask about, because asking felt like negotiating. And I had learned early that negotiating with Clara was a way of suggesting the terms were open for discussion when they were not. My own salary was generous by most standards and insufficient for what I was asked to contribute to Clara's lifestyle on top of it. I had learned to manage this through the specific, private ingenuity of a person who cannot ask anyone for help, small financial adjustments, deferred personal expenses, a retirement contribution I had suspended in the second year and not reinstated. I drove the same car for 6 years. I did not take vacations. I kept my life small enough that the portion she extracted from it didn't leave me visibly depleted, because visible depletion would have attracted questions I couldn't answer. She called me on a Wednesday in March to tell me she needed $100,000. The call was brief. She didn't explain what the money was for. She rarely did by then. And the brevity of it told me something about how far we had come from the first conversation in Maine, where she had at least performed the courtesy of a setup. Now she named amounts the way you tell someone the temperature outside. Information, not request. "I don't have it," I said. A pause, not a long one. "You'll find it." "Clara, I don't have $100,000 liquid." "Then make something liquid." Another pause, slightly longer. "Or I can have a conversation with Grandpa. The annual family dinner is in 6 weeks. That seems like a natural occasion." She hung up. I sat at my desk in the financial operations office. My office. The one with the view of the harbor that I had never once sat in front of for pleasure, always for the next problem. And I stared at the phone for a moment, and then opened the Foundation's financial system on my second monitor. Not to move money. I want to be clear about that because it matters for what came next. I opened it to look, the specific, unfocused looking of a person who doesn't know what they're searching for, but has started searching because the alternative is to simply comply again. And something in me had decided, very quietly, that compliance had reached its last available iteration. The Foundation's structure was not complicated. Grant disbursements, administrative overhead, investment returns on the endowment, donor contributions. I knew this architecture intimately. I had set up portions of it myself 3 years earlier when my grandfather had asked me to modernize the financial reporting. I knew what the numbers were supposed to look like. I opened the disbursement ledger and started scrolling. I found the first discrepancy 7 minutes in. A grant recorded as paid to a youth education nonprofit in the amount of $42,000. Standard-looking entry, proper formatting, a vendor code that matched the Foundation's coding system. I opened the corresponding bank record. The payment had gone to an account with the nonprofit's name on it, but the account number didn't match the nonprofit's actual banking information, which I found in 4 minutes by looking up their public financial disclosures. The account number matched a shell entity I had never seen in the Foundation's vendor records. I sat back in my chair. Then I opened a new tab and started looking at every grant disbursement from the previous 3 years, with the same attention I had just given that one. The attention of a person who has been looking at numbers for 5 years and has suddenly understood that he has been looking at the wrong numbers. It took me 4 hours. By the time I finished, the harbor outside was dark and the office was empty, and I had a running total on a yellow legal pad that, when I added the final figure, sat at $3.2 million. $3.2 million that the Vance Foundation had recorded as charitable grants to 11 separate nonprofit entities, each of which received a portion of the funds and routed the remainder through various intermediate steps that grew more complex as the scheme matured. To an offshore account, I traced through 3 shell entities before I found the beneficial owner. The beneficial owner was my sister. I looked at that name on the screen for a long time. Then I picked up my legal pad and turned to a fresh page and wrote, at the top, in the careful handwriting I used for things I needed to think about rather than simply record. She isn't just stealing from me. She's been stealing from the Foundation for years. I sat with that for a while. Outside, a shipping vessel moved through the harbor, its running lights marking its path in the dark water, unhurried and enormous and entirely indifferent to what was happening in the office above the waterfront. For 5 years, I had been the only person in the family with a secret. I had just discovered I wasn't. The difference between her secret and mine was the difference between something I was ashamed of and something she should be in prison for. I turned to another fresh page on the legal pad. I wrote, "Start building the file." He paid her the $100,000. Not immediately. He made her wait 9 days, which was long enough to suggest difficulty without being long enough to provoke escalation. And he moved it from a personal investment account. He had been building quietly for 4 years for reasons that had nothing to do with Clara and everything to do with the private planning of a person who understood that the situation he was in had a finite duration and that the exit, when it came, would require resources. The transfer left the account at a level that required him to recalibrate several things, and he did this recalibration in a spreadsheet he kept encrypted and never opened on any device connected to the family's network. He paid her, and while he was paying her, he was watching her. The investigation was not dramatic in its mechanics. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the sustained, meticulous work of someone who had spent 5 years maintaining financial systems and understood that money leaves traces the way water leaves marks, not always visible on the surface, but always present in the structure underneath, readable to anyone who knows what weathering looks like. Elias knew what weathering looked like. He had been reading financial structures since he was 22, and the specific weathering pattern of embezzlement from a charitable foundation was, once he knew to look for it, not difficult to identify. What took time was not identification, but documentation. Building a record complete enough that no element of it could be attributed to coincidence or error, that the chain from foundation disbursement to shell entity to offshore account was traceable at every link and verifiable at every link, and would hold under the scrutiny of a forensic accountant, a federal investigator, and a grandfather who had spent 50 years making decisions based on the quality of the evidence in front of him. He worked in the evenings, after the office had emptied. He worked on a personal laptop he had purchased in cash from an electronics retailer 2 weeks after the call where Clara had asked for $100,000, carrying it home in a plain bag, and setting it up without connecting it to any network he didn't control. He used a mobile data connection for research and kept nothing in cloud storage. He printed documents at a copy shop 3 miles from his apartment, paying cash, and kept the physical files in a locked box that he stored in a location that was not his apartment and not his office. He had learned from 5 years of living in Clara's shadow that the things you most need to protect are the things you keep in the places no one thinks to look. The foundation's structure, examined from the outside through public filings and cross-referenced against the internal records he had legitimate access to as Director of Financial Operations, told a story that was orderly and consistent on its surface and deeply wrong underneath. The grants were real. Each of the 11 nonprofit entities existed, had board members and websites and annual reports, and the general apparatus of legitimate charitable organizations. What Clara had built was not a fiction but a hybrid. Real organizations with real charitable activities, each of which was receiving slightly more than it needed for those activities. The surplus routed through a secondary account that the organizations themselves appeared unaware of, managed by signatories who, when Elias traced them through corporate registry databases in 3 states, resolved to names he had never heard and addresses that turned out to be mail forwarding services. It was sophisticated. He wanted to be accurate about that. Whatever Clara was, she was not stupid, and the structure she had built over what appeared to be 4 years of gradual development showed the kind of patient, layered thinking that he associated with people who understood that the first line of any scheme isn't the scheme itself, but the plausibility of the cover. What she hadn't accounted for was him, not because she underestimated his competence. She had always known he was competent, had relied on it, had built her extraction of the family finances on the foundation of his work, keeping the family finances stable. What she hadn't accounted for was that the competence she had been relying on would eventually be applied to her. He paid her the $100,000, and he watched her spend it. This was the part that required the most discipline, not the investigation itself, which was simply work, but the performance of continuing normalcy while the investigation was ongoing. He attended family dinners. He sat across the table from Clara and passed her the bread and responded to her comments about foundation programming with the mild, deferential attention he had been performing for 5 years. He answered her texts promptly. He did not change his affect or his cadence or the specific quality of his compliance, which he understood to be the thing she monitored most closely. Not his words, but his willingness, the temperature of his submission, which she had calibrated against for long enough that any change would register. He was, in those months, the best actor he had ever been. He had always had the capacity for it, living in the gap between who you are and who the room thinks you are for 8 years gives you a fluency in performance that people who have never needed it don't fully understand. He had spent those 8 years performing for his grandfather. Performing for Clara was not harder, only more deliberate. The offshore account appeared at the end of the 2nd month. He found it through a combination of the wire transfer logs he had access to through the Foundation's banking portal, access that was legitimate, that no one had thought to question, because he was the director of financial operations, and the banking portal was his professional domain, and a financial intelligence database he had subscribed to under a personal account for the stated purpose of due diligence research on potential Foundation grant recipients, which was plausible enough that the subscription had never attracted comment. The account was registered to a holding company in a jurisdiction chosen for its combination of banking secrecy and political stability, the choice of someone who had done research, rather than simply picked somewhere opaque. The holding company had 2 directors, both of whose names resolved, through the same corporate registry databases he had been using for 2 months, to the same mail forwarding service in Delaware that he had found at the end of the first shell layer. The beneficial owner declaration, which the jurisdiction required in a form that was technically public but practically obscure, filed in a registry that required a specific application to access and was not indexed by standard commercial databases, listed a name he had to apply to view and paid a $30 processing fee to retrieve. The name was Clara Vance. The account balance, as of the most recent quarterly statement he was able to access through the intelligence database's transaction monitoring function, was $3,241,000. He sat with that number for a long time, 3 years of patient accumulation, 4-year-long infrastructure built gradually, the amounts increasing as her confidence in the structure's invisibility increased. The shell layers added one by one as the sums grew large enough to warrant additional insulation. She had been doing this while she sat on the foundation board and gave speeches at charity galas, and smiled at his grandfather across dinner tables with the warm, uncomplicated expression of a woman who had decided that love and theft were not incompatible, as long as the person being stolen from was too old or too trusting to notice. $3,241,000 from a charitable foundation that supported children's education programs and medical research and community development in 3 cities, programs that existed and had beneficiaries and had been producing real outcomes with the portion of the money that had actually reached them. The programs were real. The theft was real. Both things were true at the same time, which was, Elias thought, the most Clara-like aspect of the entire architecture, the genuine and the corrupt occupying the same structure, each one providing cover for the other. He printed the beneficial ownership declaration at the copy shop. He added it to the physical file in the locked box. Then he went home and sat at his kitchen table and wrote, on a fresh page of a legal pad, a number, $3,241,000. He looked at it. He had spent 5 years afraid of what she knew about him. She had spent 4 of those years building a federal crime underneath the charitable foundation his grandfather had spent 30 years cultivating. And she had done it while using his fear as a mechanism of distraction, as a way of ensuring that the one person in the family with both the access and the competence to find what she was doing was too occupied with his own exposure to look at hers. He set the pen down. He picked up his phone and found the number of a criminal defense attorney he had identified 3 weeks earlier, not to retain for himself, but to consult, privately and hypothetically, about the legal landscape of what he had found. The attorney had been recommended by a law school friend who worked in financial regulation, recommended specifically for his expertise in white-collar crime and his discretion with sensitive family situations. The call lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, Elias had a clear understanding of what the documentation he had assembled would mean in the hands of the right authorities, what the federal exposure was for the conduct he had documented, and what his own position was as someone who had known about and paid into an extortion scheme for 5 years. The attorney had been measured and precise, which was what Elias had needed. The exposure for the extortion payments was manageable, particularly given the coercive circumstances. The foundation embezzlement was a federal matter. Wire fraud, charitable fraud, tax evasion across 3 years of falsified foundation tax returns. The documentation Elias had assembled was, the attorney said, unusually thorough. "How long did this take you?" the attorney asked. 4 months, Elias said. A brief silence. "You work in financial operations." "Yes." "Then you understand what you have." "Yes," Elias said, "I do." He thanked the attorney and said he would be in touch. Then he set the phone down on the kitchen table and looked at the wall and thought about his grandfather, not about the conversation he was going to have, but about the man himself, the 80 years. The company built from a regional freight operation through the specific combination of genuine instinct and relentless work, and iron-willed stubbornness, that Elias had inherited more of than Clara had, and that Clara had never understood the value of because the value of stubbornness is not visible from the outside. His grandfather had given Clara the face of his legacy because she was better at the face. He had given Elias the engine because Elias was better at the engine. He had not known that the person he trusted with the face was quietly gutting the house that the engine kept running. Elias was going to tell him. Not yet, not without a stage that was worthy of what he was going to say, and without an audience that would make what happened next impossible for Clara to manage her way out of. His grandfather's 80th birthday was in 6 weeks. The annual gala had been in planning for 8 months. 300 guests. The family, the foundation board, the company's major partners, the political and civic figures who moved through the Vance family's orbit. A room full of everyone who mattered to Clara's life and everything she had built within it. Elias began preparing for it with the same methodical attention he had brought to the investigation. He had spent 4 months building the case. He would spend 6 weeks building the delivery. The Vance family's annual foundation gala had always been held in the ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel, which was not the grandest venue in the city, but was the one his grandfather had chosen for the first gala 30 years ago and had returned to every year since, because Arthur Vance Sr. was a man who understood that loyalty to a place communicated something about character that no grander venue could compensate for. The ballroom held 320 people at capacity. Tonight it held 294, each of whom had received an invitation that described the evening as a celebration of the Foundation's 30th year of operation and Arthur Vance Sr.'s 80th birthday in that order, because his grandfather had insisted the Foundation come first on the invitation and had reviewed the draft wording twice to make sure. Elias arrived at 6:45, 15 minutes before the guests were expected, and walked the room once. He did this the way he did everything he needed to be certain about, systematically, without hurry, letting the space become familiar before he had to inhabit it under pressure. He noted the positions of the Foundation board members' table, where his grandfather would be seated for the dinner portion of the evening. He noted the secondary bar near the east wall, which was where Clara typically positioned herself in the first hour of events like this, because the east bar had better sight lines to the entrance, and Clara liked to know who was arriving before they saw her. He noted the service corridor behind the main stage, which connected to a private anteroom the hotel used for speaker preparation, and which was accessible without passing through the main guest flow. He had the folder in his inside jacket pocket. He had carried it there for 3 days, transferring it from jacket to jacket as he dressed for the preceding day's work, wanting the weight of it to become familiar so that tonight it would feel like a natural extension of himself rather than something he was carrying. It was 23 pages. It weighed almost nothing physically. He stood near the window that looked out over the harbor, the same harbor visible from his office, the one with the shipping vessels moving through it at all hours. And he stood there until the first guests began to arrive, and then he went to the entrance to greet them, because that was what the obedient brother did, and tonight he was the obedient brother for the last time. His grandfather arrived at 7:20, which was late by his standards, but which he had apparently been persuaded into by Clara, who had argued that an entrance at 20 minutes past created more impact than an entrance on time. Elias knew this because Clara had mentioned it to him 2 weeks earlier with the proprietary satisfaction of someone sharing a minor strategic victory, and he had nodded and said it was a good idea. And she had looked at him with the faint, comfortable condescension of a woman who had spent 5 years watching him agree with her, and had stopped noticing that agreement could be a tactic rather than a temperament. Arthur Vance S.R. at 80 was not a diminished version of what he had been. He was a concentrated one, the same force operating through a frame that had grown leaner and more deliberate with age, that moved more carefully than it once had while losing nothing of the quality that made rooms reorganize themselves when he entered. He wore his age the way certain structures wear their years, more impressive for having endured, the weight of time visible and not apologized for. He put his hand on Elias' shoulder when he arrived, the gesture he used for genuine warmth rather than performed warmth, and looked at him with the direct, assessing attention that Elias had been the subject of since childhood. "You look tired," his grandfather said. "It's been a busy quarter," Elias said. "You always say that. It's always true." His grandfather studied him for a moment with the specific attention of a man who has learned to read the difference between what people say and what they mean. And Elias held the look with the steadiness of someone who had been preparing for this evening for 6 weeks and was not going to be undone by it before it began. "Tonight you don't work," his grandfather said. "Tonight you enjoy yourself." "I intend to," Elias said, and meant it more completely than his grandfather could have known. Clara found him at 8:15. She had been working the room with the focused efficiency of a woman who understood that events like this were professional obligations dressed as social ones, and she had moved through 294 guests with the strategic attention of someone who knew which conversations built something and which ones simply maintained existing structures. Elias had tracked her without appearing to, the peripheral awareness of a person who has spent 5 years monitoring someone's position in every room they share. She came to him at the secondary bar near the east wall, which he had positioned himself near at 8 o'clock, specifically because he knew she would come here eventually, because the east bar was where Clara came to consolidate between circuits of the room. He had a glass of sparkling water. He had not touched alcohol since 6 weeks ago, when he had made the private decision that the next 6 weeks required his complete and unimpaired attention. "You look well," she said, taking a glass from the bartender with the ease of someone who has never once stood at a bar and wondered if she could afford what she was ordering. "Thank you," he said. "So do you." She did. This was the specific cruelty of Clara's situation, that she was genuinely good at the surface. The dress, the posture, the social fluency, the quality of warmth she projected in rooms where warmth was currency. She had built an entire life on the surface, and the surface was real even when everything underneath it was not. "Grandpa seems good," she said. "He does." She moved slightly, a small repositioning that placed them at a more private angle relative to the nearest cluster of guests. The instinctive social geometry of a woman who was about to say something she didn't want overheard. Elias had been waiting for this. "I've been thinking about our situation," she said, in the lowered register she used for these conversations. "The 100,000 covered the immediate problem, but there's another issue. I need another 50 by the end of the month." Elias looked at her. She continued before he could respond, the practiced momentum of someone who had learned that momentum was more effective than argument. "I know it's soon, but this one can't wait. And before you tell me you don't have it," she gave the small, patient smile of a woman managing someone she had been managing for years. "I know you do. You're very careful with your money, Elias. You always have been. It's one of your better qualities." 50,000, he said, by the end of the month. He looked at her for a moment. In the 5 years of this arrangement, he had looked at her many times across the specific distance of what she knew about him and what she was willing to do with it. and each time the look had contained fear in some proportion. Sometimes the sharp, immediate fear of a specific threat. Sometimes the low, ambient fear of a situation with no visible exit. He looked at her now and found, in the place where the fear had lived, something with a different temperature entirely. She registered the look. He could see her register it, a small, almost imperceptible adjustment in her expression, the recalibration of a person who has received a stimulus that doesn't match their expectations and is processing the discrepancy. "Elias," she said, and the patience in her voice had acquired a slight edge. "Don't make this difficult. Tonight of all nights. Grandpa is right over there. It would be such a shame to have his birthday dinner interrupted by a family conversation he wasn't expecting." "You'd tell him tonight," Elias said, "here in front of everyone." "If I had to," she said. "I'd rather not, but you know me." "I do," he said. "Better than you know." She looked at him. The edge in her expression sharpened slightly. "What does that mean?" Elias reached into his inside jacket pocket. He felt the corner of the folder against his fingertips. 23 pages, 4 months of work, the complete documented architecture of what his sister had built and what she had done with it. He did not take it out, not yet. The folder was not for Clara. It had never been for Clara. "It means," he said, "that I've been watching you for 4 months, with the same attention you've always assumed I was directing somewhere else." She was still. The social fluency that ran her face in every public situation had paused, a fraction of a second, the gap between the person performing and the person underneath. "I don't know what you think you've found," she said. $3.2 million, he said. "The offshore account, the 11 entities, the 4 years of wire transfers routed through shell companies to a holding structure registered in your name." The silence that followed was not long. Clara was too practiced for long silences in difficult situations. But it was long enough that Elias could see, in the specific quality of her stillness, that she had understood what he had said and was now making the rapid, private calculation of someone who has encountered a threat larger than any they had prepared for. "That's an extraordinary claim," she said. Her voice was controlled. Only someone who had listened to it for 30 years would have caught the register change underneath the control. "It's a documented one," he said. She looked at him, the full, focused attention of a woman deciding something. And then the social fluency came back, assembled itself over whatever was happening underneath, and she produced the expression of a person managing something she has determined to manage. "Then we should talk," she said. "Privately, not here. You don't want a scene any more than I do." "I don't want a scene," Elias agreed. "I want something better than a scene." He reached into his jacket pocket and touched the folder again, feeling its weight. "Stay where I can find you," he said. "I'll come back to you in a few minutes." He left her at the East Bar and walked across the ballroom toward the table where his grandfather sat at the center of his 80th birthday, surrounded by the people who had built things alongside him, and the people who had benefited from what he'd built, and the people who had used his trust to hollow out the foundation he had spent 30 years filling. He walked steadily. The room moved around him with the indifferent warmth of a party that didn't know what was about to happen in it. In his pocket, his hand remained on the folder. He had spent 5 years as the person his sister had needed him to be. He crossed the ballroom floor and thought, not anymore. Arthur Vance, S.R., was in conversation with the deputy mayor when Elias reached the table. He didn't interrupt. He stood at a respectful distance and waited, the way he had always waited for his grandfather, with the patient attention of someone who understood that the person worth waiting for was worth the patience. His grandfather registered his presence after a moment and concluded the conversation with the deputy mayor in the graceful, unhurried way he concluded all conversations, making the other person feel that the ending had been mutual rather than imposed. He looked at Elias. "You said you were going to enjoy yourself tonight," he said. "I am," Elias said. "There's something I need to show you, privately if you have a moment." His grandfather studied him with the full attention he brought to things he considered important. Whatever he saw in Elias' face, and Elias had made no effort to curate his expression for this moment, had let it simply be what it was, which was the face of a man who had been carrying something for 5 years and was about to set it down, satisfied some internal requirement, because he nodded once, the decisive nod of a man who trusts his own ability to read a room. "Walk with me," he said. They moved to the anteroom off the service corridor. The hotel had set it up as a speaker preparation space. 2 chairs, a small table, a mirror, a water pitcher that nobody had used. His grandfather sat. Elias sat across from him. He took the folder from his inside jacket pocket and set it on the table between them. "I need you to read this," Elias said. "All of it. I'll answer any questions after." His grandfather looked at the folder. He looked at Elias. Then he picked it up and opened it to the first page. Elias watched him read. He had thought, in the weeks of preparation, about what his grandfather's face would do with the information in those 23 pages, and he had not been able to fully imagine it because he had never seen his grandfather encounter a betrayal at this scale, because nothing at this scale had ever been done to him by someone this close. What he watched, sitting across the small table in the anteroom, while 294 guests talked and ate and laughed 30 feet away through a closed door, was not what he had imagined. It was quieter. His grandfather read the way he did everything, completely, without rushing, giving each page the attention it required before moving to the next. His face did not change dramatically. What changed was subtler, a quality of stillness that accumulated as he moved through the pages, each one adding to a weight that settled into him without external expression, the way a very large and very heavy thing settles into the ground when it is placed there, without drama, simply with permanence. He turned the last page, he read it. He set the folder back on the table. He looked at the wall for a moment, not with vacancy, with the focused interior attention of a man processing information against a lifetime of knowledge about the person the information described. Then he looked at Elias. "How long have you known?" he said. "About the foundation, 4 months. I've been building the documentation since March." And before March, Elias held his grandfather's gaze. "There were other things before March, between Clara and me. I'll explain all of it, but the foundation is what matters tonight." His grandfather was quiet for a moment. "The other things," he said, "are they in here?" "No, they're separate. They're also why I didn't come to you sooner." He paused. "I was afraid of what you would think of me." The silence that followed was the most important silence Elias had ever sat in. His grandfather's face moved through something he didn't try to read too precisely, because some things in a person's face are private even when you are watching them, even when you are the reason they are happening. He let it move without trying to interpret or manage it. "Elias," his grandfather said finally, "yes, in 80 years I have made many judgments about people." He looked at the folder on the table. "I have been wrong before. I am rarely wrong twice about the same person." A pause. "I have not been wrong about you." Elias said nothing. He didn't trust himself to say anything in that specific moment that would be adequate. His grandfather stood. He picked up the folder and held it with the deliberate grip of a man who has decided what he is going to do with something and intends to do it without delay. He looked at Elias once more, and the look contained things that the anteroom was too small to hold fully: grief and fury, and something that was not quite pride but was adjacent to it. The specific regard of a person who has just seen someone they love do something very difficult and very right. "Come," he said. They came through the service corridor door together and crossed the ballroom floor. And the room began to change as they moved through it in the way rooms change when the person who anchors them moves with purpose. Conversations pausing, attention shifting. The social current rerouting around whatever was happening in the path of an 80-year-old man carrying a manila folder and walking toward his granddaughter with an expression that the people who knew him best had never seen on his face before. Clara saw them coming. Elias watched her see them, watched the calculation move through her face in the second before her social fluency could cover it. The rapid processing of a woman reading a scene and understanding, in real time, that the scene had changed in a way she hadn't planned for. She was standing with a city council member and 2 members of the foundation board, holding a champagne flute, occupying the version of herself she had built her entire adult life to inhabit. The expression she produced, as her grandfather approached, was the correct expression: warm, slightly surprised. The attentive pleasure of a granddaughter at the approach of the man she had built a public identity around honoring. Her grandfather stopped in front of her. He did not speak immediately. He looked at her with the full attention he was capable of, which was considerable, and what moved through his face in those few seconds was visible enough that the people immediately around them, the council member, the foundation board members, went quiet, because faces like that produce silence even when you don't know what they mean. He placed the folder on the table beside her. "I'd like you to explain this to me," he said. His voice was quiet. Elias had expected volume and gotten its opposite, the specific, devastating quiet of a man who had decided that a certain kind of anger was beneath what the situation required. Clara looked at the folder. She looked at Elias. Something moved through her face that he had never seen there before in 31 years. Not the social mask, not the predatory calculation, not the warm performance. Something older and more undefended than any of those things, the face underneath all the other faces, briefly and involuntarily visible. Then the mask came back. "Grandpa," she said, reaching for his arm, the gesture of a woman attempting to redirect a conversation through physical warmth. "Whatever you think you're looking at, I can explain." "Open it," he said. She didn't move. "Clara," his voice carried the specific register of a man who has run things for 50 years and whose instructions have not been optional for 50 years. "Open it." She opened it. The foundation board members nearest to her looked at the first page with the reflexive attention of people whose professional role was governance of exactly the institution the document described. Elias watched one of them, the board chair, a retired federal judge named Margaret Howell who had served on the foundation for 12 years, begin reading over Clara's shoulder, and watched her face change with the precision of a person who reads financial documents for a living and understands immediately what she is reading. "My God," Margaret Howell said, quietly, to no one in particular. Clara set the folder down. She looked at her grandfather. The mask was still present, but had become something different. Thinner, doing less work. A surface that was no longer fully adequate to what was being asked of it. "This isn't what it looks like," she said. $3.2 million, her grandfather said. The number in his voice was not a question. "I was going to explain. Over 4 years," he said. "From the foundation." He looked at her with the full weight of 80 years of knowing people and knowing when he had been wrong about one. "From something I built in your grandmother's name." The ballroom had gone quiet in the spreading way of large rooms when something has occurred at its center that the periphery hasn't been told about but can feel. The music had stopped. The string quartet had registered the change in the room's temperature and had made the professional decision to stop rather than play under it. 280-some people were becoming aware, in various degrees of clarity, that something was happening near the foundation board's table that was not part of the evening's program. Clara's champagne flute was still in her hand. She set it down on the table with the careful, deliberate motion of someone buying herself 2 seconds. "If we could go somewhere private," she said, "I can explain the context. The numbers don't tell the full story." "I've read the numbers," her grandfather said. "I've also read the wire transfer logs and the beneficial ownership declaration." He paused. "Your name is on it, Clara. In a filing you made yourself, in your own name." She had nothing to say to that. The documentation was what it was. She had chosen the jurisdiction specifically because it was stable and discreet, not because it was invisible, and she had made the calculation that no one in the family would know to look for it. She had been right that no one in the family had known to look. She had not been right about Elias. Margaret Howell had stepped back from the table and was on her phone, speaking in the low, urgent register of a board chair in the middle of a governance crisis. The conversation that happens when someone with fiduciary responsibility has just seen evidence of a crime and understands what fiduciary responsibility requires of them next. 2 of the hotel's security staff appeared at the edge of the room. Not dramatically, not with any production, just the quiet arrival of people who had been called by someone and were here to perform a function. They moved toward Clara's position with the unhurried professionalism of people who do this periodically and have learned that unhurriedness is less disruptive than urgency. Clara watched them come. She looked at Elias, not with the predatory expression, not with the patience she had worn for 5 years as the armor of someone who believed they held all the leverage. She looked at him with the expression he had last seen on her face in the bedroom in Maine at 9:15 at night. 31 years old and 30 years ago simultaneously. The face of a person who has just discovered that the thing they believed was permanently theirs has been taken. "You did this," she said. "You started it," he said, not with anger, with the simple accuracy of a man stating a fact that doesn't require emotional amplification because its weight is already sufficient. She looked at her grandfather. Whatever she saw in his face, the grief of it, the fury contained in the quietness of it, the specific way an 80-year-old man looks when he has just understood that someone he loved has been stealing from him for 4 years in the name of his dead wife, produced something in her expression that was not performance. It was the first thing she had shown him in years that wasn't. She said his name. Once, the way you say someone's name when you have run out of everything else. He did not answer. The security staff arrived on either side of her. One of them spoke quietly, professionally, the language of escort rather than confrontation. and Clara set her champagne flute on the table with the same deliberate care she had used 30 seconds earlier, and straightened her posture with the automatic dignity of a woman who had spent 30 years understanding that how you left a room mattered as much as how you entered it. She walked out between them without looking back. The room watched. 290-some people, in the specific, held-breath silence of a gathering that has witnessed something it didn't expect and doesn't yet know how to process, watched Clara Vance leave the ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel for the last time. The federal investigators arrived at Clara's apartment the following morning. Elias knew this because Margaret Howell had been in contact with her foundation counsel through the night, and the counsel had been in contact with the appropriate federal authorities by 10 p.m., and the folder Elias had compiled proved sufficient, in combination with the Foundation's own records, to support the search warrant application that was filed before midnight. The charges, when they came, were what the attorney Elias had consulted had predicted: wire fraud, charitable fraud, and tax evasion across 3 years of falsified Foundation filings. The offshore account was frozen within 48 hours through a mutual legal assistance treaty request that the federal investigators filed with notable efficiency, given the quality and completeness of the documentation supporting it. Clara retained a criminal defense attorney. The attorney was good, the kind that gets retained when the person retaining them has a great deal to lose and understands that the quality of the representation matters. The attorney was also working against 23 pages of documented evidence assembled by someone who had spent 4 months making sure nothing in it could be attributed to coincidence or error, and that constraint shaped the legal strategy available to him considerably. The process took time, as federal matters do. Elias did not watch it closely. He followed the procedural updates his grandfather's attorneys sent him, attended the 2 depositions where his testimony was required, and otherwise returned to the work that had always been his. The accounts, the subsidiaries, the financial reporting that kept the company's engines running. His grandfather called him on a Sunday morning 3 weeks after the gala. "Come to the house," he said. "Sunday lunch, just the 2 of us." Elias drove to the house in the suburb where he had grown up, parked in the driveway where his grandfather's car was the only one, and ate Sunday lunch with an 80-year-old man who had spent the previous 3 weeks doing something that was visible in the way he moved and spoke and sat. The specific, quiet labor of a person revising a fundamental understanding of something they had believed for a long time. After lunch, his grandfather set down his fork and looked at Elias across the table. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't," Elias said. "I didn't see what was in front of me. She worked very hard to make sure you didn't." His grandfather was quiet for a moment. "You said there were other things between you and Clara, things that were why you didn't come to me sooner." Elias looked at his grandfather across the table they had sat at for every holiday of his life, in the room that smelled of the same furniture polish it had smelled of since he was a child, in the house where he had learned that the gap between who you were and who the family needed you to be was something you carried privately and indefinitely. He told him all of it, not the version that managed the information, not the version that softened anything for the audience, the actual version, the one he had been not telling for 8 years. In the same direct, unhurried way he presented financial analysis to people he needed to understand something completely. His grandfather listened without interrupting. His face moved through things Elias didn't try to read too precisely, because they were his grandfather's to move through, and some things belonged to the person having them rather than the person watching. When Elias finished, the room was quiet. His grandfather reached across the table and put his hand on Elias' forearm. He left it there for a moment. "You should have told me sooner," he said, not as a reproach, as a regret. "Not because of what I would have said, because you shouldn't have been carrying that alone." Elias looked at the hand on his arm, the hand that had built things for 50 years. "I know," he said. "I understand that now." The formal succession announcement came 6 weeks later. At a board meeting Elias attended in the same conference room where he had attended board meetings for 5 years, sitting in the same seat, in front of the same view of the harbor. His grandfather made it himself, standing at the head of the table, stating in the plain, declarative language he used for things he had decided without ambiguity that Elias would be assuming the role of president of the Vance Group and the Vance Foundation, effective the first of the following quarter. There was no performance in it. There was no drama. It was simply his grandfather saying what was true in a room full of people who had been paying attention and understood how they had arrived here. Elias sat in the conference room afterward, When the meeting had ended and the other board members had filed out and the room had returned to its ordinary quiet, and looked at the harbor. The same water, the same vessels moving through it with the unhurried, enormous indifference of things that have been making the same journey for decades and will continue making it regardless of what happens in the offices above the waterfront. My sister used my darkest secret as a leash to bleed me dry for years. I didn't lose my inheritance. I took the leash and I gave it to the man she feared most. He watched a vessel move through the harbor until it passed out of the window's frame, and then he opened the quarterly report on the table in front of him and got back to work. There was, as always, a great deal of it, and for the first time in 5 years, none of it belonged to anyone but him.